May 18th marks the 80-year anniversary of the deportation of Crimean Tatars from Crimea by the Soviet regime. Yes, we're going to talk about that Crimea that by international law is a part of Ukraine, that Crimea which geolocation you've only probably learned in 2014, or maybe in 2022, or maybe you still have no idea where it is and now is your chance to pull up a map and find it. My name is Rida. I'm Crimean Tatar, or Kırım Tatar. Today I want to tell you the story of my grandfather, and through it the story of my people, Crimean Tatars. Most Kırım Tatars have at least 4 stories like that, one for each grandparent. Some have just 1 or 2 because some people just did not survive the event, or were too afraid to pass the story on, or it was too painful. For as long as I can remember myself, I've known about May 18th, 1944. I've known about what we call sürgünlük, the deportation. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I do want to add one disclaimer. Crimean Tatars are the indigenous people of the Crimean Peninsula. But the original pronunciation of our name is something closer to Kırım or Kırım Tatars. You see, Crimea and Crimean Tatars as words came to English through Italian la Crimea. So there is cri in that version. But English, being the weirder that it is, reads the I letter as I in some cases instead of E, unlike other European languages like French or Spanish or Italian. So if you can hear the difference between crime, and cream, you know you can pronounce Kırım. In 21st century, when there is less barriers in communication between different nations and peoples, we might as well take the endonym the native population uses, which is Kırım and Kırım Tatars. More often than not in this video, I'll be referring to Crimea as Kırım, Crimean Tatars as Kırım Tatars. After all, if you know how to read and pronounce the country named Qatar, the one that has a lot of oil and is in West Asia, Kırım wouldn't be that different in pronouncing. Though I understand that some of you might be more inclined to know names of places that have a lot of oil rather than ones they don't. But I digress. Let's take a step back and rewind the clock a little bit and look into a popular, unfortunately, myth. Historically Russian Crimea. But it wasn't exactly that. For centuries, Russia has been calling dibs on Kırım, but come on, calling shotgun on the front seat of the car doesn't make exactly the car yours, right? So you get the idea. Kırım Tatars had their own statehood with Crimean Hanat, Kırım Hanlığı, reigning from 1449 to 1783. One of our Hans actually burned Moscow down, while Ivan the Terrible fled the city, letting his people burn. Not to sound too callous, but given our history, that little fact kind of warms my heart. And the irony of the guy nicknamed the Terrible, cowardly fleeing the city till the fire settles down is just uncanny. Later on, we had the short-lived Crimean Republic in 1917-1918, but you know how it gets when Russia gets involved. So let's take a look at the timeline after the Crimean Hanat. On April 19, 1783, Catherine II, the one a lot of people know as Catherine the Great, but I'm not going to call her that because there's nothing great in plundering, eradication, and destruction, let alone that her name was actually Sophia Augusta Frederica von Anhalt-Zerbst. She's German. But anyways, Catherine II issues a manifesto claiming that Kırım is now a part of the Russian Empire. Then she proceeds to rename the major Kırım Tatar cities to the names that sound Greek, if you know that good old Russian dream of becoming the Third Rome. That's it. Apyatchik becomes Simferopol, Kislev becomes Eupatoria, and Kırım itself becomes something that would sound like Taurida. After Tauri, Scytho-Cimmerian inhabitants of the peninsula in the, hold on to your seats, first millennium BC, as in 1,000 years before Christ, as in long before then, even 2,024 years ago. Interestingly enough, the international maps weren't as quick to follow Catherine's desire to erase the original names. There is an example of the 1844 map that has the original Kırım Tatar names next to the Russian alternative. There are versions of this even in the maps of the 1930s. The events of 1944 were the last nail in the coffin of the original Kırım Tatar toponyms. So, after the act of Catherine II, the next step is 1918. The Bolsheviks barge into Crimea and arrest the president of Crimea, the head of directorate, Noman Çelebici. And on February 23, 1918, they execute him in Akhyar, most commonly known as Sevastopol. The body of Çelebici was thrown into the Black Sea and never retrieved. Still think that communism is cool? Let's move on. The famine of 1920s, specifically 1921-1923, hit Crimea pretty hard with a devastating death toll estimated at around 30% of the population. And take a guess who were the majority of the 30% of population. Unfortunately, the famine of 1921-23 is not that well researched, so I hope in the coming years we'll get more information on it. And we move on to the Great Purge, or the Great Terror. See which one you prefer. On April 17, 1938, 36 Kırım Tatar leaders, intellectuals, writers, teachers, researchers, or as it translates to Soviet language, socially hostile persons, were executed by the order of the Soviet dictatorship. Kind of something around April that had bad juju for Kırım Tatars. So between the empire's land grab in 1783 to the Bolsheviks rolling in like they owned the place in 1918, Russia's been trying to get its hands on Crimea for centuries. Throw in a famine here, some executions there, and voila, you've got an alternative recipe for eradicating the native population. Just takes a bit of time. But let's not forget about one of the main ingredients of such a course, the deportation. May 18th, 1944. Now, you might wonder what were the reasons behind the decision to deport Crimean Tatars from Crimea. The official version is Crimean Tatars deserted the Red Army and we, all of us, were collaborators with the Nazis, which has been proven 100 times and over as not true. Even the Soviets had a hard time painting that picture because Soviets themselves had about 7 heroes of the USSR that were Kırım Tatars, and hero of the USSR is essentially the highest award, military award that you could get, similar to a Purple Heart. There are numbers thrown, but essentially there are different numbers proving that the majority of Crimean Tatars, the overwhelming majority of Crimean Tatars served in the Red Army. There was, of course, a certain percentage that collaborated with the occupying force, but that happens in any occupation. Same thing happened in other nations across the Soviet Union. Same things happen even nowadays on different sides of different wars and conflicts. This is my grandfather, Mesut. And this is his written testimony of the day of the deportation and the aftermath. He was 15 years old when, at 4 a.m. on May 18, 1944, a knock on the door woke his family up, and his mom at the time was 41, his brother was 11. Not exactly the description of a soldier that fought on the other side, right? The following is a translation of his personal testimony. On May 18, 1944, before the dawn, at 4 a.m., we woke up from someone banging on the door and the bedroom window. 2 soldiers entered. They were led by an officer, all armed. The officer ordered us to quickly dress and get outside to be ready in 15 minutes. He said we were being evicted and we should take some food for the road. Scared, we just had enough time to get dressed. We got pushed out and they brought us to the main square of the village where everyone was being gathered. We only took a pot, 3 spoons, 1 cup, a blanket, a winter coat, and a jug of sour cream. At the point of gathering near the village's well, you could see the families coming from all the sides accompanied by armed soldiers. The square itself was surrounded by soldiers with machine guns. All around you could hear people crying. Everyone thought that we're going to be executed and thrown into the well, just like it was with Jewish people. We stood there until about noon. At around 12, 13 o'clock, when the trucks came, they started loading us. Some families had a few sacks of bindles. Those would be taken and thrown away. Our family and many others didn't take much. There wasn't much to take from us. They brought us to Peresip train station, where a train of 2-axle 16-ton boxcars was waiting. All the people from one village, 120, 130 people, were put in one boxcar. It was so tight you couldn't even sit, let alone lay down in the car. The train departed around the evening. I could tell because we passed the Chongar Bridge sometime around sunset. The first stop was Melitopol. They opened the doors and carried out the first dead elderly, Ablatif Al-Baba. He was barely wrapped in shroud, but by the time the doors closed, we saw him already laying on the ground naked. They didn't give us food. We were parched as we didn't have much vessels to keep the water in, to store the water. I remember the stop in Liski. They opened the door again. Before opening the door, they would surround the train with armed Red Army troops. And at that point, we wouldn't think of escaping because they shot 2 teenagers that tried to run. Their bodies were just left there. We couldn't take them with us because on every stop, the dead bodies would be carried out and be left on the side of the road. They wouldn't let us bury anyone. We were standing in Saratov for a long time. Don't know why. But then we managed to make some dough from the little food we had left. They gave us some slop. We were so hungry, we would take what we could. They were giving 1-2 ladles of whatever dish vessel you had. On the 14th day, our train arrived to Chirchik, Tashkent region of Uzbek Republic. Throughout the whole train ride from Qıram to Chirchik, no sanitary norms were followed. No medical help was given. Upon arrival, we had lice, were sick, had typhus. They started to disperse us into barracks, 2-story unfinished houses. Those had 2-room sections. One section would have 2 rooms of 12 and 14 square meters and the kitchen of 4 square meters. Each section would have 7 or 8 families, basically a corner per family. We had orders to check in at the commander's office every 10 days. If you didn't, you could go into the labor camp. Between 1944 and 1956, we were persecuted for singing our folklore. Even mentioning Qırım as the homeland of Crimean Tatars could hurt us. Until 1956, Crimean Tatars weren't allowed to apply to universities. I returned to my homeland, my Kezlev, Eupatoria, on August 26, 1990. Returned as a homeless man. Now, that's not the full story of my grandfather, but it is the highlight. Now let's talk about the aftermath. First of all, a lot of people died on the road. A lot of people died in the first 2 years of the exile, not being able to recover from the diseases they picked up on the road or as a result of extremely hard labor in the settlement places and malnourishment. In 1956, the new Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev condemned Stalin's policies, including the mass deportation of various ethnicities, most of those deportees were now allowed to move back to their homelands, except, did you guess it? Are you guessing it? Crimean Tatars. They also did not allow to return to their homelands to Soviet Germans and Meskhetian Turks. Crimean Tatars, which we're focusing on for the purposes of this story, had to stay in exile for another 30 years. In 1967, Crimean Tatars demanded the correction of injustice the USSR did against our people. The USSR did as much as acknowledge the charge of treason against our entire nation was unreasonable, and still did not allow Crimean Tatars the same full rehabilitation rights as to return to their homeland. In these merry times, we were not called Crimean Tatars, or Crimean Tatars for that matter, but, and I quote the official document here, citizens of Tatar nationality who, having formerly lived in Crimea, have taken root in Uzbek SSR. This is the official formulation from Soviet documents. Would be quite a mouthful to put into a ethnicity box. Might have a bit of a spelling problem there. As if we just all woke up 4 a.m. entire villages on May 18, 1944, and all said, well, this place is nah, let's move on. Why don't we all just take a ride into the nowhere and leave all of our belongings behind? Anyways, only in 1989, the ban on the return of the deported ethnicities was finally lifted, nulled, void. In 1989 and 1990, Crimean Tatars began to return to Qırım. They would leave the life they were able to build from scratch in exile and return home to start from scratch again. We were not welcome. Again, we had to fight, albeit peacefully, for any piece of land. Luckily, we're still standing, but unfortunately not without the hardship. Now, I already mentioned that a lot of people died. So if we look at the numbers, the official NKVD report estimates around 27% death toll. Crimean Tatar activists did their own census and calculated up to 46% death toll as a result of the deportation. Between June 1944 and January 1945, a mere half a year into the deportation, the following relatives of my grandfather died. Cemil Aydin, 52 years old. Emine Aydin, 44 years old. Their daughter, Ediye Cemil, 6 years old. Her sister Munire, 9 years old, actually survived. Acımula Cemadin died at 46. Maksude Cemadin died at 41. Anife Cemadin died at 52. Tesella Mahmud died at 42. Rustem Abla died at 22. Fatma Abla died at 20. Riza Abla died at 19. That list has 10 names. And those are relative of just one boy. One 15-year-old boy. How many others were there? I guess we will never know the exact number. So let's recap. In 1783, Russia occupied Qırım for the first time. Back then, Crimean Tatars were 90% of the population of Qırım Peninsula. Since then, the native population started to decrease dramatically till it became zero in 1944. As you can imagine, the Russian population grew. 1920s, Russia during the collectivization took every piece of land and cattle from my great-grandfather, everything he earned with hard labor. Speaking of my great-grandfather, because you're kind of familiar with my grandfather already, what happened to him in 1944? He wasn't deported, not because he was serving in the army at the time, not because he was fighting for the Nazis either. Simply put, he died in 1937 in a Soviet labor camp. My grandfather was deported from his homeland in 1944, had to live in exiles for 46 years, and at the age of 64 he had to start from ground zero. My mother was born in exile, and sometimes it was easier for her to pass as Uzbek because being Crimean Tatar was harder. I was born in exile, though I had the luxury to grow up in my homeland. In 2014, Russia yet again occupied my home, Qırım. I haven't seen the house I grew up in since 2021. This is the picture of my grandfather, inviting you to the temporary house he built to live in while he was building the house for our family. On the back of this photo, there is an inscription written by him. It says, "For the edification of future generations, how hard it is to return your homeland." And here I am, his future generation, recording this video, not from my homeland, not from Qırım. There were around 200,000 stories like that for every deported Qırım Tatar. Some were tragic, some were inspiring, but all equally painful. In Qırım Tatar, we say, "Unutmadık, unutmayacağımız, unutarmayacağımız." We have not forgotten, we will not forget, we will not let forget. I haven't forgotten, I will not forget. And hopefully through this medium, I will not let you forget. Thank you for watching this video. I will be glad to hear your thoughts in the comments.